I'm Darrell Press. I'm Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth College. Today I'll be interviewing John Fisher Burns. Mr. Burns is a guest of the Montgomery Endowment here at Dartmouth, where he is an in-residence fellow. The Montgomery Endowment brings distinguished visitors to campus to teach courses, to meet with students, and to interact with the greater Dartmouth community. Today I'll be interviewing Mr. Burns about his many years of experience with the New York Times, particularly about his experiences in the Middle East and his current assignment as the New York Times Bureau Chief in London. I wonder if we can start by talking about the situation in Iraq. I think the American public has a sense that things are going much better today than they were going 18 months ago. But could you describe in a bit more detail how things have improved and what conditions are today in Iraq compared to how they were?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that a lot of the change occurred after I left. I spent the current year in a new job as Bureau Chief in London, but my wife has remained in Baghdad, and of course I have an obsessive interest in what's occurring there. And what I hear is extraordinary, and I think curious, this understated by the military command that has pulled this off. I think that there was a deep sense, I won't call it a trauma, but certain sense of chagrin in the Pentagon and amongst senior generals who had been involved in the enterprise in Iraq over the illusionism that prevailed from 2003 through 2005-06. General Petraeus was one of those generals who was engaged in one way or another in that illusionism. You could call it optimism, but it certainly proved to be misplaced after February 2006 with the attack on Samarra, when it looked like the whole country was descending into civil war. So one of the lessons learned has been that they will never again get into a position of overstating what they've accomplished. They're going to understate it. And I think that General Petraeus, General Odiano, and others who have been engaged in the surge have, at least from what I'm hearing, especially from my wife, and you can imagine I hear a great deal about it from her, is understated. Perhaps the most graphic way I can illustrate this is I had a text message recently from Dexter Filkins, who is a colleague of mine at the New York Times, has just written a book called The Forever War, which I think is undoubtedly one of the better, if not the best, Iraq war books. Dexter may very well in time come to be seen as the David Halberstam of this war. He sent me a text message on his mobile phone in the last month saying, I'm sitting here in Adamir, ground zero of the insurgency, a neighborhood on the east side of the Tigris River in Baghdad, Sunni, hardline Sunni, home of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. It's where it was founded. The place where Saddam Hussein made his last stand on April the 9th, 2003, as US troops were capturing the city. He stood on top of a Volkswagen Passat in front of the Abu Hanifa Mosque and waving a Kalashnikov and said, I will be with you forever, just before he went underground, almost literally underground. Dexter said, I'm sitting here at a coffee shop in front of the Abu Hanifa Mosque. He said, I'm surrounded by a crowd of people, Sunnis, who are coming up, shaking my hand. You American, let me buy you a beer. And he said, it's unimaginable. 1 year before I got that text message, we had, regrettably, a senior member of our staff, Iraqi staff in Baghdad, was assassinated on his way to work and was buried before dusk in the cemetery behind the Abu Hanifa Mosque. I had hired this guy. I was very fond of him. He was 23 years old. I wanted to be at his burial. Our Iraqi security said, there's no way we're going to take you. It's only 2 miles from our bureau. No way we're going to take you there. We'll have another burial before dusk if we do. That's how dangerous Adamir was. Now it's become a place where Dexter Filkins in the New York Times can walk around without a flak jacket, where US troops don't wear helmets. It's not quite like that everywhere. There is still violence and still serious violence, but the overall levels of violence are down by 70% across the country, by 80% in Baghdad. US casualties, as you know, have been, since July, higher in Afghanistan than in Iraq. And who could have imagined any of this a year ago?
Why do you suppose the U.S. military commanders are cautious about reporting progress and are perhaps understating the progress they've made?
Well, you know, Darrell, from the the American military process called lessons learned. It's a very impressive process. I think many institutions could benefit by adopting this system. Something goes wrong, a Humvee is hit by a roadside bomb, an IED. Within 24 hours, any lessons to be learned from that have moved all the way from, shall we say, Tikrit, Iraq, to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the Lessons Learned Center is, back down all the way to the platoon level. It's an excellent system. It's a system that the military take very seriously. And one of the lessons learned in Iraq was, as I say, don't overstate what you've accomplished. Understate it. And one reason for understating it is, of course, as General Petraeus has said repeatedly, that these gains are fragile and reversible. They are. It's beginning to look, there are some early signs that they may be less fragile and less reversible than pessimists might think. The New York Times ran a story the other day on our front page about Iraqis pulling down blast walls. To anybody who lived as long as I did in Baghdad, that's absolutely indicative. The city became progressively locked in by concrete. The New York Times, for example, we built a compound for ourselves, which in military terms could be called a FOB, a forward operating base. We had no choice. If we were going to survive and be able to operate, we had to put up 18, 20-foot high concrete blast walls, machine guns, razor wire, elaborate checkpoints 500 yards out. And this was replicated all over town. The blast walls are beginning to come down in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods. People want to move freely. They want free access to their markets, to their schools, to their clinics. In a sense, they're voting by doing that. They are saying, we think that this will last. It's a difficult thing to put up blast walls and expensive. You don't pull them down unless you have some confidence that you're not going to have to put them up again. I think there's an exhaustion with the war. The levels of killing became so outrageous. We were regularly seeing 3,000 dead a month in Baghdad. It was not uncommon to wake up and hear that 50, 80 bodies had been found with bullets in the back of their heads on wasteland, and in this part of town or that part of town. The situation looked completely out of control. I did not cover the war in Lebanon, the civil war, which lasted 15 years, in some sense has never really ended, but during the real fighting phase of that, I asked when I did go to Lebanon afterwards, what brought this war to an end? The most common answer was exhaustion. People just tire, however strongly they may feel about their party in the war, however much threatened they may feel by the opposing parties. Eventually, people get exhausted, and I think we might hope that the same has happened in Iraq.
I wanted to ask you more about this compound. You described this compound in the talk you gave yesterday. It sounded like a forbidding place. Are New York Times journalists and other journalists still living in places like this, holed off from the population?
Yes, yes they are. Yeah.
From your sense, when a journalist today goes out in Iraq to follow up on a story or to follow a lead, is it still a situation where they go and meet for 15 minutes and hurry back to the compound?
No, apparently that has very much improved. There was a time when if anybody went into a particularly difficult area, I was the bureau chief, and the general rule we had was you don't stay more than 15 minutes. It was difficult to make these judgments. By their instinct, journalists, and thank God it's not otherwise, they want to get to the story. They want to talk to people. But I took it as my charge, my responsibility, to get the journalists to Baghdad and get them home safely. And we've so far, touching wood, we've succeeded in that, although we have lost members of our Iraqi staff who are considerably more exposed than we are because they live out there. They don't live in the compound. They move back and forth, and that's the most dangerous part of their day. To be known to be working for the Americans can be a death certificate. So yes, we do live in a heavily guarded compound, and it's cost the New York Times a great deal of money. It's by far the most expensive by a factor of, who knows, 5 or 10 times than any bureau we've ever had anywhere. But it has allowed us, there are two ways of viewing that. One, our detractors say, well, you've walled yourself off from the realities. Not true. What we've done is we made it possible to continue to operate with some margin of safety, and we're out of that compound every day. In the worst times, it was only in armored cars with a chase car with armed guards in it. Journalists do not carry weapons. The bravest of our correspondents, who didn't much like going out in armored cars and thought that it attracted attention, would venture into dangerous areas in soft cars. I didn't have to say much like that. But we would send out scout cars, that's to say people who would go and look and see how bad the situation was. But the net of it is that if, to those who say you were walled in, you were hemmed in, you were occluded, you couldn't tell us the reality, I say, and I'm speaking primarily of the New York Times because I know it best, but I could say the same of the BBC, of the Washington Post, of the Los Angeles Times. Those media organizations which took this war seriously and were prepared to commit considerable resources to it have told the story that readers and viewers and listeners needed to know. There's been nothing important about this war that an American voter, for example, needed to know to be able to cast his ballot in the midterms in 2006 that you won't have found in the New York Times. That at least is my profession. I think it is actually the truth.
At least from my perspective, it's certainly understandable why it is that Western journalists who were covering the war at such risk were living in one of these fortified compounds in Baghdad. As an American voter, on the other hand, I wonder today if there aren't such compounds in Mosul and Fallujah, Nasiriyah and Basra, how much can journalists who are risking their lives, who are taking considerable risks and making great sacrifices, still how much today could they know and be reporting about the real political situation that's driving things in Iraq today, the militia politics, the alliance politics, the trends and the tides in the Sunni awakening, if people are operating from a single compound in Baghdad and foraying out on day trips?
Well, first of all, it's more than day trips. Generally speaking, what we've done is moving outside Baghdad since about the fall of 2004, when the two uprisings by Muqtada al-Sadr meant that the United States was fighting a two-front war against the Sunnis and the Shia. We've tended, when we've moved out beyond Baghdad, not exclusively, but mainly to go on embeds with the military, who have become more flexible about disembedding. That's to say, you want to go to Mosul, you go to Mosul as long as you have a genuine reason for going to Mosul on a Black Hawk helicopter or on a C-130, and don't just use the military as a taxi service, and you write about what the military is up to, you can disembed and then go out into the city. Now, we also have Iraqi staff in all these cities, and they're pretty good. They're the canaries in the mine. The mobile telephone service works very well in Iraq. Do we fully understand the complexities? No, we don't. But then I worked in China for 7 or 8 years on 2 assignments, and in the Soviet Union and other difficult places, and we are always occluded from realities that we would like to know. I think the ambition is not to tell the whole truth. The ambition is to tell as much of the truth as is as accessible and is as essential. So do we know, for example, one great hole in our coverage has always been the insurgency. You can't really cover the insurgency in Iraq. Why? Because you end up quickly dead. Even if you could get to the Sunni Saddamite insurgency, the relationship between those folks and Al-Qaeda was murky. There was some kind of symbiosis, and there was always the risk that you would end up in the hands of the bad guys. Very difficult. I don't think anybody ever really crossed that barrier. There are some journalists at some times who claim to have spent some time with the insurgency, but it wasn't clear in most of the stories I read whether the people they were with were real hardcore insurgents or simply who presented themselves as being. They never gave their names. They usually appeared in masks. So that it's difficult to access it. But my sense of this is this, that in any profession, yours, lawyer, doctor, fireman, police officer, whatever. Part of your success, a large part of your success, is navigating the obstacles that present themselves to you. You have to be imaginative, you have to find workarounds. That's what we did. The obstacles in Iraq were rather higher than they had been, in my experience, most other places, including most other places at war. And we had to be inventive in finding our way around them. And I think, frankly, that we did pretty well. As the bureau chief, I was not the most adventurous person. I didn't have to be, but we had some mainly very young, very smart people, some of whom have already gone on to other assignments elsewhere in the world, who were extraordinarily adventurous, brave, and did get the story. So it makes me very uncomfortable when I hear people saying, well, the American press never really cracked the case in Iraq. Those criticisms very often come from people, I'm not saying you, but from people who've never had to deal with these kinds of things, where the cost of getting it wrong in a case like this for long periods in Iraq was to lose your head, literally lose your head. So I think some of our critics have got that upside down.
As bureau chief, did you worry that the very nature of the way that you guys were living, which is your living conditions reflected the fact that there were thousands of people out there, principally on one side, who wanted you dead, who were actively trying to kill you, who had, in fact, killed colleagues of yours and people
Yes.
working for the Times. Did you worry as bureau chief about the difficulties of maintaining objectivity in the context of a war where your very surroundings demonstrated to you on a daily basis how in danger you were and how much one side
It's
wanted
true.
to kill you?
The criticism of me by some of my colleagues, many of my colleagues, American colleagues in Baghdad, when we decided, as they said, to go hard, that is to say, to start building a compound, which was that your compound looks indistinguishable from an American FOB, forward operating base. I made that decision after the attacks on the United Nations compound in Baghdad in August of 2003, followed quite quickly by the attack on the International Committee of the Red Cross. I went to both places and walked in the rubble, as I thought at the time, in a sort of a testimonial to friends of mine who had died in both places. But came back thinking there's a message written 10 feet high in this rubble, and that is that if they will go for United Nations diplomats who for years have fed 2/3 of the people of Iraq and run their hospitals for them and provided them with their medical supplies, and then the International Committee of the Red Cross, they'll certainly come for us. And we were quite close to these two compounds, that we are going to have to protect ourselves. But at the time, the criticism made of me was that you are making yourselves indistinguishable from the occupying force, and that will cause the bad guys, as they were commonly called, the bad guys to come for journalists as well. And I said the bad guys do not need provocation to do that. They're going for Westerners. Nothing that we're going to do is going to change that. And I think that the way that they behaved when they did get journalists showed that that was true. So yes, we understood that there was a problem, that there was a natural identification, if you will, not just culturally but psychologically, with the forces under whose protection we ultimately lived, which is to say the forces of General Sanchez, General Casey, and General Petraeus. But and I think people need to give us some credit, that most of us have been steeped for years in a culture of non-partisanship. This doesn't mean neutrality. I'm absolutely convinced that neutrality is a poison in our business. That's to say, I don't believe I'm paid to be neutral. I'm paid to be fair. And being fair sometimes comes to lead you to some pretty stark conclusions and choices between people. People who cut people's heads off, I think deserve to be identified for what they are. I can't be neutral about that. And a lot of things that the insurgents did in Iraq, as you well know, placing bombs at schools and weddings and in the forecourts of mosques and driving 900 people off a bridge during a pilgrimage into the Tigris River who drowned, this kind of thing, they were unacceptable by any standard, not just an American standard, but by any civilizational standard. So yes, there was this problem of identification, but I think that we were aware of it, and on the whole that we handled it well. It would have been better if we had been able to access the insurgents and to listen to what they had to say. As it happened, we were left mostly with what they had to say on the internet. And they've used the internet very effectively. So it wasn't as if we didn't have any voices. We had voices. We just didn't have faces. We didn't have names. We didn't have personalities.
I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about Afghanistan.
Yes,
how would you describe conditions in Afghanistan today and how they're changing?
Well, very, very worrying, I must say. I left Afghanistan to go to Baghdad in the fall of 2002 and didn't get back until the fall of 2008. I've just returned. I left Kandahar and Kabul on Sunday. One of my last interviews before I left, a press conference actually in Kabul in 2002, I noted this from my notebooks that I picked up when I went back to Kabul, was with Douglas Feith, who was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, I believe, at the time. And I'd asked him at a news conference at the American Embassy, they were talking about September, October 2002, how many troops do you believe the United States will need to pacify Afghanistan? He said maximum of 5,000. Well, 7 years have gone by. General McKinnon now commands a force of 33,000 American troops, rising by next spring probably to 40,000. He's saying he needs more. He wants 3 more combat brigades. The overall NATO force is about 65,000 at present. And it's commonly agreed by all the NATO commanders, and certainly by the entire chain of command, American chain of command, from General McKinnon to General Petraeus, who takes over at CENTCOM at the end of October, to General Craddock, the NATO commander, to Secretary of Defense Gates, that the NATO forces are inadequate to deal with the rising Taliban threat. The problem is, where are the troops coming from? The Europeans aren't going to provide them. The United States can't provide them until there's a build down in Iraq. That's not likely to happen even under the most optimistic scenario until the new president is in office. If it's Senator Obama, he said 90 days and then 16-month build down. So it may be another year before you can begin to recycle troops out of Iraq to Afghanistan. In the meantime, the war there is deteriorating from a NATO and American point of view every day. Violence is up by 30%. The Taliban own the night, the Taliban own the countryside, or much of it south of the Hindu Kush. They and their al-Qaeda allies are importing ever more the lessons learned from Iraq. It's more and more an asymmetric war, that is to say, the use of roadside bombs and assassinations. And in the southwest, where the heart of the insurgency is right now, you have Taliban massing in hundreds, storming provincial capitals. So the situation begins to take on ominous overtones of what happened to the Soviets in the 1980s. There are differences, of course. This is a multinational force operating under a United Nations Security Council resolution and behaving by any standard in a way that's a lot more benign than the Soviet troops did. But it's legitimate, I think, at this point, to look at the history of Afghanistan and remind ourselves that no foreign invader in Afghanistan in centuries has managed to emerge in anything other than defeat and a rabble, the way that the Soviets did. Is this going to happen to us? We'll see. There are things that are going to change. The war strategy will change. General Petraeus, I know, has some ideas about that. He says that some of the, not all by any means, but some of the lessons learned in Iraq may be applicable to Afghanistan. Some others aren't. It's going to be a very long haul. And the bottom line here is, there doesn't appear to be a withdrawal option. Let's not forget that in the case of Iraq, the United States was in effect locked into a discussion, a bitter political discussion from 2003-04 on about whether we should be there or not. That has, of course, the intensity of that discussion diminished as with the success of the surge. It's still there. In Afghanistan, there's been very little of that discussion. Why? Because that's where 9/11 came from in the first place. My sense of it is that Americans have a feeling that they simply cannot, Americans in general, we cannot afford to lose in Afghanistan if it means that the country reverts to extreme radical Islamic fundamentalists in the Taliban who gave sanctuary to and encouraged al-Qaeda in what happened in 9/11. If you can't withdraw, you've got to win. The question is, how do you win and how long? The Pentagon is talking now about a war strategy, a new war strategy for 5 to 10 years. Well, if it's a 10-year strategy, and we've been there 7 years already, that's 17 years. So I'm talking to kids on this campus, young people, I say to them, you know, it's possible that we may still be engaged in Afghanistan when you are middle-aged, when you have children of your own. And that's a pretty grim prospect from every point of view.
Given the ungoverned, maybe ungovernable areas in the Fatah region of Pakistan right across the border, even if the United States can create stability somehow, manage stability in Afghanistan and turn the country around so that the regional provinces are being well managed and security, does that really accomplish much from a strategic sense if the main achievement at the expense of British lives and American lives and other coalition lives, if the major achievement is to ensure that the Taliban and al-Qaeda can no longer plan from Afghanistan, and now they must do it from the Fatah region of Pakistan?
That's a really serious issue. Let me just put it this way. I think the realization of the New York Times is that Pakistan and Afghanistan are going to be arguably our principal concern in foreign coverage now for the years ahead, and that Pakistan may be an even greater concern and may spend more time marching across the front page of the New York Times than anywhere else. So, you know, the obvious parameters here, they have nuclear weapons. It's a country of 165 million people. It's a failing, if not already failed state. It's bankrupt. It's run now, whatever we may think of General Musharraf, it's run now by an extremely dubious agglomeration of people who failed egregiously when they ran these so-called, I say so-called democratic governments of the late 1980s through the 1990s. Nawaz Sharif and the late Benazir Bhutto and her husband Asif Ali Zardari, now the president. You only have to go back and look at the record of these people in the 90s to know that they're extremely weak reed on which to premise a new policy. Corrupt, venal, incompetent, and you know, this is supposed to be better than Musharraf. That's an extremely difficult nut to crack. Zardari is saying that, you know, as a victim of terrorism himself, he is resolved to do something about the Northwest Territories. But the fact is that all governments of Pakistan have had to make their compromises with Islamic fundamentalists because of the bitter, bitter rivalries between the principal parties, so-called democratic parties. There's always this option, this tendency, this inclination to do deals with the Islamic fundamentalists who rule in the Northwest Frontier Province and in the Fatah, as you call the federally administered tribal areas. I don't know how this is going to be solved. We cannot occupy a country of 165 million people. We don't really have reliable allies to help us sort this problem out. When we pour money into these countries, as we've done in Pakistan over the past, since 1991 especially, something in the order of $10 billion in aid, where does it go? It tends to end up in Swiss bank accounts. It's a pretty unpromising prospect altogether.
I want to change tacks again, and this time, or for now, just talk to you about the field of journalism, the practice of journalism. Yeah. You've been covering international politics and conflicts for a couple decades now. How has the job changed?
Well, I think if you talked to, you know, the Ernest Hemingways of the Spanish Civil War, they would be deeply envious of us for a number of reasons, one of which is technological. The mobile phone, the satellite phone, the computer have made it possible for us to range the world, to report our stories and write and deliver them, same for the broadcast people, without any impediment. It's a huge change. And when I started out as a foreign correspondent in the early 1970s in China, I had to file my stories from a cable office. And cableese, I think most people of a new generation journalism don't even know what that is. It was a special kind of code language to save money. Stories sometimes wouldn't land on the desk at the newspaper I was then working for several days. I actually made one trip in Africa where I spent a whole month in the Central African Republic and came back and discovered nothing I had written had ever landed. Well, now, instead of spending whole days and sometimes a week trying to deliver your story, you write it, you hit the the send key, and the stories on the desk in New York, and in this huge technological change. Are we any better? Probably not. And maybe the technology has softened us up somewhat. I think the generation of foreign correspondents running from, what was his name, William Henry Russell, who went to the war in Crimea in the 1860s, who sometimes is regarded as one of the, the pioneer foreign correspondent through to the Spanish Civil War. These were pretty tough guys. And one thing I'm sure of is that they didn't sit around in the bars of Paris in 1936 saying, gee whiz, if we go there, have we got war insurance? Are we going to be covered? How dangerous is it? Now, I'm regarded in some quarters in our business as a dinosaur, because my view is if you're a foreign correspondent, which is a very richly rewarded job, and I don't mean so much financially, you don't get rich in our business, but you have an incredibly rewarding life. You've got, as they say, a grandstand seat, a front row seat to some of the events that move history. Who would not want to do that? My view of it is that if you are a foreign correspondent, much better a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, you've got to be prepared to repay the rewards of being a foreign correspondent by doing some tough things and going to some tough places. That's somewhat changed now. There are people who opt not to do those things. If you have young children, it's understandable. And because it was the case at the New York Times that a lot of mid-career people did not want to come to Baghdad, the Chinese have a saying, out of all things good, something bad, out of all things bad, something good. Well, this was very clearly the case for us in covering these wars. We recruited much younger people, very often people who had no experience working abroad and not even very much experience in the business at all. And we found some exceptionally talented people. Prime case is Ed Wong, a young Chinese-American, University of Virginia, University of Berkeley, came to us off our business desk where he, as I recall, had only been a year, 18 months. Ed Wong these youngsters, and I speak as somebody of 64, they learn incredibly fast. Ed Wong is a top foreign correspondent. He's now in China. I think probably we're a more educated generation than the ones that preceded us. We have all of this technology, and we have resources. I don't know what the New York Times foreign budget was in 1936, but in my time as a foreign correspondent in the New York Times, now 35 years or so, the resources dedicated to covering the world are extraordinary. Nothing irritates me quite so much in my new domain as the London bureau chief of the New York Times, as a Brit, born and educated, than to hear people who should know better, and I'm talking about very often educated middle class, or as they would say, upper middle class Brits, saying that America doesn't know anything about the world, and they'll tell you they've been to the United States, very often to Florida or to California, and they've read a paper, usually USA Today or something like this. And by the way, it's not even true of USA Today. There's nothing in there except baseball and Hollywood, and there's nothing about the world. It infuriates me because, and we're not alone in this at the New York Times, but to speak of the New York Times, no newspaper in the world, no newspaper in the world dedicates more money, deploys more talent into the world to inform people about what's going on. And fortunately, this lesson is now getting well beyond the borders of the United States as a result of the internet. The New York Times is a great paradox because we're going through a time of great financial turmoil. This year, for the first time, we had to reduce our editorial staff in New York by about 10%, the first such reduction in the history of the paper, certainly in my time at the paper. It's a tremendously stressful situation. Our stock is trading at a fraction of what it was 2-3 years ago. Common story in newspapers. But what gives me heart is that there are 8 to 10 times as many people reading the New York Times as there were 10 years ago. Why? Because we have this enormous audience on the internet. And the excellence of the product, as I see it, of which I contribute a tiny, tiny fraction, is there for all to see. I think that we will survive this troubled time on the basis of our excellence. And I think that those millions of people who are reading us around the world, and I'm now discovering everywhere I go, Afghanistan, everybody, the young generation, particularly in Afghanistan, they've all got mobile phones and they've all got access to the internet one way or another. It's an astonishing and maybe absolutely definitive change, given that it's the most powerful educational tool in the history of man since the invention of the book. So I think that we will survive, and we may even go on to some sort of sunlit upland. I hope so. And it's a great satisfaction, I have to say, as a reporter, to have this vast audience. But there's no longer any hiding place. It used to be that I could go to, even as recently as the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan. My full name is John Fisher Burns. I was known to the Taliban by my middle name, but they work on the analogy of their own names. And somebody whose name is Dost Muhammad Wazir calls himself Mr. Muhammad. So I became known as Mr. Fisher. My actual name is Burns. And the Taliban upbraided me when I went into the foreign ministry one day, and they said, there's this very bad man here, is Mr. Fisher. And Mr. Burns, they called me Mr. Fisher. Mr. Burns is writing very bad things about us, and we can't tolerate this. Who is he? And I said, yeah, he's a big problem for me too. Well, now in the age of the internet, I couldn't get away with that, because in the foreign ministry of Hamid Karzai's Afghanistan, they've already read the New York Times on the internet in the morning, and they've seen that my full name is there. So, I think it's a lot easier, the job we do, than we did 30, 40 years ago. And perhaps also it matters more.
Can I change directions one more time? As you said a few moments ago, you're now the New York Times bureau chief in London.
Yeah.
What's it like for somebody who grew up in the UK, who spent decades away, to now be back, both living there and also trying to take a step back and learn new things about the country and report with fresh eyes?
Well, I'd have to say there's an open verdict on that. It was very much part of my thinking when I left Afghanistan, Baghdad, a year ago, with great regret, was that what an opportunity to return to a country where I grew up and was educated after 40 years abroad, and learn about Britain the way I'd learned about Russia, China, India, Africa, at the expense of the New York Times. The first problem has been transiting from war to peace. It turns out, paradoxical as it might seem, that war is a lot easier to cover than peace. War basically writes itself. The drama of war carries you onto page one. So you have to be a lot more inventive when you're covering a country at peace. And when you were away as long as I was, not just the 7 years since September the 11th, but I've been on the dusty horizons of the earth for most of the past 35 or 40 years. It's a big transition. On the other hand, it is a great opportunity to learn about my own country, and I have to cope with something that was quite unexpected. The England that I knew, I was born in 1944. I went to a boarding school in 1953. It turns out that the England that I knew was an idyll. I had gone away to the dusty corners of the earth believing that we were the most civilized country on earth, that we were, for example, the most courteous people. And it's been a little bit disappointing to me to come back and discover that that's no longer true. I think you could make an argument now, I would, that the most courteous people on earth are the people of the United States. So it turns out that I had an idyll of my own country, which of course of the 1940s and 50s, which couldn't possibly be sustained in a country which has changed so radically since then. Now after, 9 months or so, I've begun to see beyond that and to realize that there are some very wonderful things about Britain, and I'll cite two, which I'm sure are very familiar to most Americans. The BBC, a state-funded broadcasting corporation, which is a voice of truth to the world, sets the standard in broadcasting, an unmatched standard. At checkpoints across Afghanistan for 30 years, we came to know there were two things that military checkpoints, you're crossing front lines, two things that you could shout that would get you through quicker than anything else. One of them was BBC. Oh, BBC, please, go through. And the other one, go figure as they say, is Manchester United. Oh, Manchester United, please go through. I've never been able to figure out. They think that I'm I'm a right winger for the Manchester United football team. I don't know, but magical words.
Scout.
Scout, maybe. Yes, maybe scout. So the BBC and the National Health Service. I actually sit here, as I'm going to speak whilst I'm here, at the medical centre about being a cancer survivor. It sounds a little maudlin, sentimental to say it, but the fact is that I am still above ground and not below ground because of the excellence of American medicine, cancer medicine. Now, thankfully, some years back, I came out of the NHS system in England into the excellence of American medicine, and American doctors did what the British doctors said they couldn't do, which was to fix my problem. So I know about the benefits of high cost, high technology American medicine. I also know about the 40 million Americans who have no medical insurance. My former editor at the New York Times, Joe Lilliveld, who was very considerate to me when I was at Sloan Kettering in New York for a year, I said to him, I feel very vexed about this. You know, I see patients in Sloan Kettering who are being progressively bankrupted by the cost of their medical care. On the other hand, I came to America from no hope to hope. And Joe, who's a pretty smart guy, said, I sat and see what your problem is. He said, as far as I can see, he said, just keep telling yourself that Britain has the kind of medical care you'd want for your country, and America has the kind of medical care you'd want for your family. So I don't mean by saying that the National Health Service is the jewel in the crown, just to draw negative comparisons with American medicine, but universal free medical care, free at the point of delivery. Of course, it's not free, you pay for it in the taxes, is a wonderful thing. So I'm coming to redevelop a sense of affinity for my own country, which was a little shaken when I got back and discovered that how much hooliganism there is and how much binge drinking there is and the behavior of crowds at football games and so on, all of which was a bit of a shock to me. And I'm coming to enjoy myself.
One final question. What would you say to young people who are thinking about a career in journalism? Is this something that you think is still a wonderful and promising career, or do you have reservations about
I
that?
do, and I met last night here at Dartmouth with some very bright young people. And I asked, is there anybody here, there were about 15 of them, involved in actually war and peace studies, international relations. Your students, many of them, I'm sure. I was a little disappointed when I asked, is there anybody here in journalism, when none of them were. They're interested in pursuing careers in government, in State Department, and intelligence, etc. Now, I think if I'd asked that question 10 years ago, a lot of hands would have gone up. What's changed? I think we just have to be realistic and say that ours is an embattled profession, and it's harder, much harder for young people to say, I want to go into journalism, I want to be a foreign correspondent with the New York Times, when there are serious questions as to whether the great institutions of journalism in this country can survive. I think we will, but if I was plotting a career, I'd certainly be inhibited by that. I think there was a huge kind of, there was a tremendous rush into our profession that was speeded by Watergate. I think what Woodward and Bernstein did in Watergate drew into our profession a more educated, more ambitious group of people than we had seen before, who had options to become lawyers, doctors, engineers, whatever. I think that's receded, and I think there's also a sense that ours is not a particularly well-rewarded profession financially. So all of this has caused a narrowing down. It may be temporary. My own son is going into our business, and I've said to him, you know, you're choosing, he's a photographer, you're choosing a very, very hard road, and you may go hungry sometimes. But you will be richly rewarded in other ways. And for myself, I'd say, since I just lucked into this profession, I just fell backwards into this profession. I didn't go through college saying I want to be a journalist. I just walked into a newspaper one day because I had a girlfriend in town. I didn't want to go on chopping down trees out of town. I wanted to be in town. And I walked into a newspaper and said I'd like a job. That's how serendipitous my entry into journalism was. And I'd like to have more money than I do. I'd like to have a prospect of a more comfortable retirement than I do. But I certainly can't regret having had a life that has been absolutely filled with adventure.
John Burns, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.